Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. In today's video, I'm going to be suggesting some places to start with short science fiction and fantasy by Black authors. In honor of Black History Month, I thought this would be a useful video to do. There is so much amazing science fiction and fantasy being written by Black authors, but sometimes a good place to start is with something that's not too long and not too intimidating, especially in these genres. So today I'm going to be recommending to you 20 books and graphic novels that I have read that are all under 350 pages. Most of them are significantly shorter than that, but I do have a couple books on this list that are a little over 300 pages, but I'm including them because I think they're still pretty quick reads. These are books that span a range of subgenres. They're all pretty accessible and quick to read, and ones that I have personally read and liked that I've grabbed from my bookshelves. In some cases, there are authors who've written a lot of short works, but I picked one that I think is a good introduction to their work. And in a couple of cases, I've got books by authors who tend to write much longer books, but if you're looking for an easy way to jump into their writing style and get a feel for some of the themes that they explore, these might give you some options. So whether it's for Black History Month or any other time of year, because we should read these books year-round, here are 20 recommendations for science fiction and fantasy by Black authors. I'm going to start with the graphic novels. And comics, I have quite a few of them here. Sometimes I feel like this gets left out, but there can be really cool storytelling that happens in graphic novels and comic books, and I think these are worth noting. Again, this is barely the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more out there than this. This is just pulling from things on my shelves from a variety of publishers, some more mainstream and some indie. My first suggestion is Jelia by Junie Ba. This is a blend of science fiction and fantasy that is drawing on West African mythology, and I thought this was really cool. It's a little complicated, you do have to pay kind of close attention, but I think it's a really great story. The artwork is also done by the author of the book, and he is from Senegal. Jelia can be a little chaotic at times, but it's really interesting in terms of world building. It's an epic sci-fantasy novel that blends technology with fantastical elements and drawing on mythology from his home country, and also using some of their language and symbols in ways that I think are really cool. So if you haven't checked this out, I would recommend it, and it's a pretty quick read. Next is a graphic adaptation of a book that is too long to be in this video, but one that I really like, and I think it's a very good graphic novel adaptation. It's Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky by Kwame Mbalia. I have read the full-length novel of this a couple times, and I have read the graphic novel, and I do think this adapts it really well in a much more accessible way for readers who are a little nervous about picking up a 400+ page middle grade book. This is written for children, but I think people of any age could read it and enjoy it. It's really funny, it's heartwarming, and it's doing some cool things with mythology. Essentially, it's a portal fantasy. It follows a young boy named Tristan Strong from real-world Chicago who is grieving the death of his best friend and for reasons falls through a portal into a world populated with figures from African and African-American mythology and legend, and has to try to figure out a way to save the world he's fallen into. It's really fantastic. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. And again, the graphic novel is a pretty quick read. Then I've got a couple of comics from an indie comic press that I've worked with a couple times. This isn't a sponsored video, but they have sponsored me in the past. But I also just genuinely love the work that they do. For adults, we have Chioma, Curse of the Jangora. This is from PETA Comics, and it is an African-inspired epic fantasy story with really great artwork. It is female-led. It has a pretty badass female main character. It's more intense in terms of the violence, but it's also got a lot of political machinations going on, and it leaves off in a place that leaves you wanting more and looking forward to Volume 2, which I have not had the opportunity to read yet, but I believe Volume 2 is available now, or if not yet, will be very soon. So this is a great option. Also from PETA Comics is a more family-friendly fantasy novel called Olaju, The Edge of Origins. I loved this too, and I hope we get a sequel. This is also drawing on West African creation mythology. It follows 3 young planters of the Nkpura Osisi, which means tree people in the Igbo language, as they journey to save the cultivation of the earth after the high priest decides to take control of creation itself. This artwork is gorgeous. Like, absolutely stunning. I cannot get over it. And the story is really interesting. It's really compelling and I loved it, but this is one that you could also share with kids if you wanted to. Next is a historical fantasy that is inspired by real history. This is Malika Warrior Queen, Volume 1. I have not read the following volumes, but I really liked this. It's set in 15th century West Africa following the exploits of a queen and military commander. And again, this is based on real world history, and one thing that's cool about it is that throughout the book it has little notes where it talks about the real history that it's drawing on, even though this is certainly more fantastical and has magical elements to it. I really liked it, and I think it's worth a read. Lastly for this section is a comic book by one of my all-time favorite authors, and she is generally somebody who writes more lengthy, dense science fiction and fantasy, so if you've been looking for an easy way to get into her writing, might I suggest Far Sector by N.K. Jemisin. It is no secret that I am a huge fan of N.K. Jemison's work. I love her work, and I am not somebody who's read a lot of DC comic books. I hadn't read Green Lantern stuff before this, but she did a standalone story set in the DC Comics universe that is a version of a Green Lantern story, and I loved it. It's so good. Like, this was one of my favorite books the year that I read it, and it was right near the end. Only N.K. Jemisin could do this. I was so impressed at the level of world building and character development and plotting that she was able to put into this. It was the combination of really amazing artwork that did a lot for the story and her writing, which was just incredible. It's got queer characters, it's got interesting political and mystery elements to the plot set in space. I freaking loved it. It was amazing. So if you haven't picked up Far Sector, highly recommend. And if you've been looking for a way to easily slide into N.K. Jemisin's work, this might be an option for you. Next is novellas, and I've got 9 of those for you. And then we will finish up with full-length novels that are still on the short side. I have this here as a placeholder because I wanted to remember to include this novella, but The Deep by Rivers Solomon is a fantasy novella with horror elements that is pretty intense emotionally and really beautifully written. It draws on the history of the Middle Passage, where enslaved Africans were being transported by ship to the United States or to the colonies, and some of them, including pregnant, jumped off the ship and drowned rather than go and be enslaved. And in this novella, it imagines that those people instead developed the ability to live underwater as sort of mer people, and it follows a character who is the holder of their painful memories so that they don't all have to live them out. It's a beautiful and heartbreaking novella that is dealing with collective grief and trauma and healing, and it's amazing. River Solomon's work is incredible, and this is, I think, a really interesting novella to pick up. Another author that you really should be reading is Nnedi Okorafor, and I grabbed 2 books from her, even though she has written far more than this, but these are 2 pretty accessible novellas and places that you might start with her. Binti is literally like 90 pages. It's the first of a trilogy that's very short and I think incredibly inventive. It follows a young woman from a futuristic version of Africa who is the first to leave her people to go into space to this interstellar university, and what she experiences along the way and the way that that changes her. I love this entire series. I think it's great, and this is a good place to start. Very quick and easy. I also really like Remote Control, which I think is another good introduction to the way that she works. It's very inventive, it's deeply driven by character and ideas. This one is following somebody that people call the Daughter of Death, and it's a hard one to sum up quickly, but it is set in a futuristic version of Africa. It deals with interesting technological elements, but then is also drawing on things that feel like magic and feel like mythology, and are unpacking a lot of ideas about girlhood and coming of age. And yeah, it was great. I think this is fantastic. I don't have the first book physically, but this is the second book in a novella series that I really like. I liked, I think, book 2 better than book 1, but they're both really interesting. This is The Truth of the Aleke by Moses Ose Utomi. It is a companion novella to The Lies of the Ajungo, and I think there's going to be more that we get. These are The first one feels a little bit like a fable that is also fantasy, and this one I think we get a little more character work and plot, but these are being largely driven by the themes that he's exploring that I think are done in really interesting ways. This one was kind of heartbreaking, and again, they're really short, really inventive, the writing is gorgeous, worth a read. If you want something that's going to be hard-hitting and you have not yet tried reading Tochi Onyebuchi, I've got to recommend Riot Baby. I thought this was phenomenal, but it is a heavier and more intense one. Even though it's not very long, I did have to take breaks with it just because of the subject matter. This is a near-future dystopian science fiction novella with some kind of fantastical elements, following a Black brother and sister, one of whom has been imprisoned and both of whom are living under a police state, but then they start developing superpowers. This one is really heavy on social commentary, and I think it was the book that needed to come out when it came out, which was, I think, 2020, if I'm not mistaken. No, it came out in 2019. I feel like it was very timely, and a lot of people were picking it up in 2020 when there was a lot going on with the murder of George Floyd and all of that. So I think this one is really good and a good introduction to his work. His adult books are more intense. If you like this, I definitely recommend reading Goliath, but it is very experimental and one that you have to kind of take your time with, but his work is amazing. Then if you want something that's paranormal with a side of romance, you could read Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. This is a historical paranormal murder mystery with a sapphic romantic relationship at the center of it. It's got angels and demons set in an alternate version of early 1900s Chicago, and I loved this. I feel like it uses every word in the story to progress what it's doing with the plot. I know this isn't everybody's favorite, but I am a big fan of C.L. Polk and I really loved this novella. Another fantastic one that I don't see enough people talking about is A Taste of Honey by Kai Ashante Wilson. This is so fascinating from a literary perspective and I think really smart. It's a sci-fantasy blend, so I would say this is science fiction that feels like fantasy because it's set where most of the characters don't understand the technology that makes it science fiction, if that makes any sense. And it draws on sort of the vibes of mythology, even though it's really kind of futuristic if you read between the lines. Absolutely loved this. One of the things that is contentious about this book, but I was such a fan of and I thought was really smart, is there is a linguistic difference between the way that the main character thinks in his head and the way that he speaks. And I thought this was so brilliant because it's a way of doing a form of literary code switching, showing that on the page. It's awesome, but there were people who thought it was weird and didn't like it. But I really loved this novella. I like other things I've read from Kai Ashante Wilson, and I would recommend it. You know I have to suggest Peach Jelly Clark because his work's amazing. The one that I have from him physically is horror, but it's like a sci-fi horror, so I feel like this works. That is Ring Shout. This, I think, is my favorite thing I've read from him, but I have enjoyed everything I've picked up from him, and I think I've pretty much read everything he's published at this point. He's got a fantasy series that's got kind of steampunk vibes set in historical Cairo. This one, though, is set in 1915 in the United States when Birth of a Nation came out, and it's being used by the KKK, except that maybe the KKK are even more monstrous than they really seem. The main character is a part of a girl gang who goes and takes out these monsters, and this was brilliant, wonderful. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. I won't say more about it than that, but Peach Jelly Clark in general has a lot of really, really good short fiction that you should pick up. The final book that I have for novellas, and maybe this is technically a short novel, it's like 200 pages long, but this is Tread of Angels by Rebecca Roanhorse. Another example of somebody who I think writes amazing longer fiction, but if you want something short to try her with, Tread of Angels could be a good option. This is an interesting little book. It's a genre mashup in a way that I've never really seen before. It's sort of this like historical Western fantasy with paranormal elements and a murder mystery. So there's like angels and demons. It's set in what feels like Old West America, but with magic, and there's a murder mystery element to it. So I kind of loved it. I thought it was great, but it's very different from anything else that I've read before, but maybe go check it out if that sounds up your alley. Lastly, we have the novels. And I think the longest book in this is like 320 pages, so they're all, relatively speaking, on the short end. I'll start with the two books I have that are written for kids, and then I will move on to the adult fiction. First up, we have Miles Morales' Spider-Man by Jason Reynolds. I really loved this. It's fairly short, under 300 pages, and it's, I would say, for upper middle grade, lower YA is who it's really written for, but it's a coming of age story of a Black Miles Morales living in New York City and becoming Spider-Man, and I thought this was really good. There is also a follow-up book to this that I think is incredible. It's this one, Spider-Man Suspended, which is the same Miles Morales, so like taking place right after the events of this, but it's a novel that is partly in verse, and it's just a really interesting format, but also very, very good. So for sure recommend those. And then the other one is a cozy middle grade fantasy novel set in a small town that I just adored. This is Just a Pinch of Magic by Alicia Dow. It's got friendship and baking magic. It's got queer adult characters. So the two main girls, their dads seem to be kind of into each other, which is very cute. And they get into some trouble with what's going on in their small town. So cozy fantasy romance for kids. I loved this. Moving on to the adult novels, I had to include something from Octavia Butler in here. And this is one of her shorter series openers. It's just under 300 pages. And I don't know that this is the best place to start with her, but it is a place you could start with her that I think is accessible and gives you a sense of the way that she likes to mess with ideas and morality and make people uncomfortable on purpose, and that is Wild Seed. Wild Seed is the start of the Patterness series, which I have not yet continued with, but I do plan to finish it. I will eventually read all of her books. I love her. But this covers a lot of ground in terms of time. It starts centuries in the past, following two characters who are basically immortal and go back and forth between being lovers and enemies and have very different ethos on what you should do with the power that you have and what that looks like. It is it's a lot. It starts in the time when people from Africa were beginning to be enslaved, and then brings us all the way through slavery and civil rights in the United States, but with this really different sort of lens. And I loved it, but there are a lot of content warnings, so check those if you need them. There's a lot of really dark stuff that happens. There's some deeply unsettling things that happen, and that's there on purpose. She likes to make people uncomfortable for good reason, I think. But Wild Seed, if you want a not necessarily light, but relatively short introduction to her work, is an option. Then for a book that is blending science fiction and horror, you could try Escaping Exodus by Nikki Drayden. This is really unique and unlike anything else that I've read before, and I also think very, very smart. It follows characters who are living in space as sort of parasites inside of this giant living beast that sails through the stars, which is weird and is a way that we get a lot of horror elements, kind of visceral body horror type stuff. But what's really interesting about it is that the society they have is a matriarchy. And so one of the things this is doing is looking at misogyny and gender roles by flipping that narrative on its head. What if the same sort of standards and roles were assigned to men in a society? And what does that look like, and what does gender really mean and sexuality really mean? And I think it's so brilliant and intense and just really unique and inventive. So maybe try Escaping Exodus. The last two books that I want to recommend are the two longest. One of them is just over 300 pages and one of them is like 320 pages, but they're still right in the ballpark. And these both have strong romantic elements to them. So if you like a romantic subplot in your science fiction, these might be a good option for you. First up, we have The Space Between Worlds by Kai Johnson. This was a really impressive science fiction debut novel. This is a multiverse story, which I think is really cool, and it has a sapphic romance at the center of it. It's doing some interesting stuff with time and what if there are multiple versions of yourself through time and what does that all mean, but it's really interesting. There is a sequel to this coming out in 2024 that I'm curious to pick up as well, but this could be a good place to start that's relatively recent. And then the other one is The Best of All Possible Worlds by Karen Lord. I originally picked this up because of Angela at Literature Science Alliance, who absolutely loves this book. I didn't adore it as much as she did, but I did still really like it, and I've kept it on my shelves. This is really interesting. It's a quieter science fiction novel that is really about societal structures, cultures, and relationships between people. And it does have a central romance, but it is a very, very slow moving, slow burn romance that is happening across a lot of other kind of vignettes that feel like they're drawing on cultural anthropology to a certain extent. And I really like this. I think what it reminds me of is Ursula K. Le Guin's approach to writing science fiction. So if you're a fan of the way that she does science fiction, where it's slower moving, more thoughtful, looking at it from a sociological and cultural perspective, I think that this book would probably appeal to you. There you go, 20 plus some extras. I think I actually had like 21, 20-ish, 20-something recommendations of places to start with short fiction by Black sci-fi and fantasy authors. These are all things that I love, I do recommend them, and hopefully that gives you some new things to check out and new places to start as you are continuing to find things to read throughout Black History Month and the rest of the year. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts on anything I talked about in this video. And for question of the day, I would love to hear any of your suggestions. Who are some Black science fiction and fantasy authors that you are a big fan of, or places that you would suggest people start? Let me know in the comments down below. If you like this video, it always helps if you give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.